Good evening, everyone. My name is Mishka Ligot, and I'd like to welcome all of you watching from the comfort and safety of your respective homes to the final installment of Wisconsin Wednesdays, this 2020, featuring fiction writer Danielle Evans in conversation with Beth Nguyen. This is our final event of the year, and we'll be back with an exciting lineup of writers next spring. For those of you joining us for the first time this week, Wisconsin Wednesdays is an online reading series brought to you by the UW-Madison and program in creative writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival. In light of the current health crisis, Wisconsin Wednesdays was designed to continue with the program and foundation's practice of hosting brilliant writers, many of them alumni of the program, currently promoting their new books. Along with rising to the challenge of social distancing measures and the inability to currently gather in person, we hope that Wisconsin Wednesdays, through its new virtual platform, is also able to carry out the Wisconsin idea, which declares that the borders of university are also the borders of the state. So we welcome you, whether you're joining us from Madison, Milwaukee, Marshfield, Marinette, Mineral Point, Menominee, Manitowoc, Mequon, or anywhere else in the state, the US, or the world. We'd like to take a moment to thank and promote our partnering independent bookstores from all over Wisconsin. Our Room of One Zone in Madison, the Room of One Zone in Madison, the bookstore in Appleton, the Village Booksmith in Baraboo, Honest Dog Books in Bayfield, Redberry Books in Cable, Inklink Books in East Troy, Daughters Books in Eau Claire, Woodland Pattern in Milwaukee, Foxden Books in River Falls, Arcadia Books in Spring Green, Mind Chimes Bookshop in Three Lakes, and Driftless Books and Music in Viroqua. Please, please, please continue to support your local bookstores throughout this pandemic and consider placing an order for Danielle's book through any of these establishments tonight. Most offer shipping or contactless curbside pickup. You can find their contact information on our webpage, tinyurl.com/whiskweds. That's tinyurl.com/whiskweds. Before we proceed with the reading, we'd like to recognize that Wisconsin Wednesdays is being broadcasted to you from Tijop, which is historical Ho-Chunk land, historically ceded and occupied through unjust legislations and treaties such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830. We recognize the Ho-Chunk as the original and true stewards of this land and honor their continued resistance and resilience, along with that of the other 11 First Nations that reside within the areas of this state. Danielle is joining us from Baltimore, Maryland, the unceded lands of the Piscataway people. Finally, in the spirit of resilience and humanity's collective capacity for resourcefulness, we'd like to thank you viewers for your patience with this new online format. And so please bear with us should there be any technical issues that may arise during this reading. We will have some time for some Q&A with the author after she reads. So please use the box at the bottom of the Crowdcast page to submit any questions you have for Danielle at any time during the reading. And we'll do our best to accommodate your queries later during the event. Tonight's event will be moderated by Beth Nguyen, author of the memoir Stealing Buddha's Dinner, the novel Short Girls, the novel Pioneer Girl, and a professor at the UW-Madison in creative writing. Take it away, Beth.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm really happy that I get to introduce Danielle Evans and moderate the Q&A after she reads from her beautiful new book, The Office of Historical Corrections. Danielle Evans is the author of the story collection Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, which won numerous awards, including the Pan American Robert W. Bingham Prize, and her work has been published and anthologized widely in the Best American Short Stories, the Paris Review, and American Short Fiction, to name just a few places. She teaches creative writing at Johns Hopkins University, and before that, taught here in Madison at the University of Wisconsin. Danielle, welcome back to Madison, at least in this virtual way.
Hi, it's nice to be back, if virtually. I'm sorry that I can't see everybody, but thank you so much for being here on a Wednesday night, because it is my belief that we are among friends. I'm gonna read from a story that, even though it's one of the older stories in my new book, I have never read from before. So you heard it here first. I'm actually only going to read half the story so that there's enough time for Q&A and conversation. So this is a story called Alcatraz. Everyone had told me that Alcatraz was nothing but a tourist trap, but I was desperate that summer for anything that would give my mother a sense of closure, and it seemed fortuitous that the prison that had opened all the wounds in the first place was right in the middle of the water I could see from the window of my new apartment. I hadn't come to the bay on purpose. A string of coincidences and a life I hadn't known I'd wanted until I got there brought me to Oakland. Still, almost since the day I had arrived, it seemed like the only thing keeping me from the island was deliberate avoidance. I felt like I'd gotten it backward. Everyone else I'd met who'd come to California from the East Coast was running away from something, and I'd gone and gotten so close to the sting of the past that it sometimes seemed like I could touch it. I'd come west to work at an experimental after-school theater and dance therapy program for children who'd been abused. A friend I'd gone to college with spent months recruiting me, sending me literature about the program, smiling children's faces, photographs of the Bay and the Pacific. I was sold on the adventure, on the postcard perfect water-specific shade of blue, but by the time I said yes, she decided to move to Texas to begin a PhD program. I went anyway. I was 24 and convinced that the life in which I made some critically important difference to everyone around me could start on my command, that the world was only waiting to know what I asked of it. I was anxious and exhausted all the time then, but I remember those days now as being filled with optimism, a sense of possibility. The organization's budget was so strained that our supervisors worked for free some months when we were between grants. I made ends meet tutoring and doing SAT prep for kids in Berkeley and Marin County. Two of our college student volunteers quit after working at the center for less than a week. One of them had her cell phone stolen, and the other was cursed out by 4 different kids in 3 different languages. My own first week on the job, a child had threatened to stab me with a pencil, but by and large, I loved the work I did. The crayon drawings and earnest thank you letters I got to pin to my wall, the way kids who used to greet me with skittishness at best, open contempt and hostility at worst, started running to hug me when I walked through the door. My mother had never been to the West Coast and didn't like that I was there. We were East Coast people, and this coast had done us wrong, almost kept us from existing. My great-grandfather had done time here, had been kept in the basement of Alcatraz, and been told every day that when he was dead, they would feed him to the rats. He was 18 then, finally of legal age to be in the army, except he'd been in it 3 years already thanks to a falsified birth certificate. It was 1920 and Alcatraz was still a military prison, infamous not for its gangsters, but among would-be deserters. They were still building the parts of the prison that would later be immortalized, but it was already enough of a prison to be Charles Sullivan's private hell, the one he never really left, the one my mother, God bless her, was still trying to redeem. My mother was born nearly 4 decades later, born at all because after 2 years, the army, with the help of his appointed lawyer, admitted their mistake. They cleared him of murder and told him he was free to go. He took the long way back to the Bronx, spent years trying to make himself homes in inhospitable places. But when he finally arrived back in New York, he married Louise, the first woman who took pity on him, and they had 2 children, the younger of whom was my grandmother. I never met her. She left a few months after my mother, a brown girl in a white family, was born. When my mother was 6, a neighbor told her to her face that her own mother was too ashamed to stay in the house and claim her. After she came home crying, Charlie Sullivan pricked his finger and then hers and pressed them together and said they had the same blood now, and whatever she was, he was too. But my mother was too young to have heard of the 1-drop rule, and the intention was lost on her until years later. My mother called her grandparents Grammy and Papa. Grammy was firmly assigned the role of grandparent because they all chose to believe her mother might return someday, but Papa was her everything. When she was 13, her Grammy died, and my mother belatedly came to appreciate what she had done while alive, squirreled away money before Papa spent it, saw to it that the rent was paid and the heat was on, and everyone in the house had clean clothes and 3 meals a day, and that her husband stayed sober enough to work, except when he had the prison nightmares, and he had to be kept drunk enough not to wake the neighbors with screams. At 18, my mother left for college. She only went as far as Jersey, but her grandfather was dead within 2 years of her going. It wouldn't occur to me until well into my adulthood, most of it spent in California, a full country away from her, to question my mother's conviction that the former event had caused the latter, or to wonder what she wanted me to do with a cautionary tale in which the caution was against growing up. By the time she came to visit me in Oakland, my mother had been involved in some form of litigation or negotiation with the US government for the better part of 20 years. Her latest calculations, which she had me double check annually, adding to the accrued interest, concluded that the US government owed us $227,035.87. She wanted the number exact so that we did not seem unreasonable. I was a kid when she started with the complaint process, first with the letters to the Board for Correction of Military Records, the same board her grandfather had been writing letters to for years before he died. This was right after my parents' divorce, though I'm not sure it's fair to imply the correlation. Before the divorce, they had fights about the fact that she wouldn't sell any of Papa's old belongings or dispose of the boxes of paperwork. But it wasn't those fights or any other that finally broke them up, so much as the way they had less and less to say to one another when they were happy. With my father out of the house, my mother threw herself into a mission to clear her grandfather's name, to finish in her lifetime what he hadn't been able to finish in his. There were no adults around to talk her out of it, only me. She asked me what I would do if someone told a lie about her, asked if she died with it still written down somewhere, whether I would ever give up fighting to prove the truth. I knew that the only correct answer was no. Her odds of succeeding were low. When she started the process, it had been 15 years since Papa's death and more than 70 since the conviction. Still, there was a logic to her argument. The discharge paperwork she kept carbon copies of in our attic said he'd been pardoned, and she thought it would be easy from there to have his dishonorable discharge changed to an honorable one. It didn't make sense, she reasoned, that if he'd been cleared of the crime he was accused of, the government should consider him dishonorable. As years passed without action or response, she was buoyed by occasional signs of what she saw as precedent on her side. In 1999, Lieutenant Henry Flipper, the first Black graduate of West Point, had been given a posthumous presidential pardon more than 100 years after he was falsely charged with embezzlement in a scandal designed to push him out of the service. My mother had bought a bottle of champagne and shared it with me while we watched the official pardon ceremony, where descendants of the late Lieutenant Flipper sat on a podium with Bill Clinton and Colin Powell and received a formal apology. Do you see what happens, my mother had asked me, when you don't give up on making things right? But what I'd seen happen before that brief moment of optimism, and especially in the 5 years since, was my mother becoming increasingly dependent on an outcome that seemed less and less likely. She taught elementary school, but all of her holiday breaks, half days, and weekends went into the litigation, into letters to the army, the president, her congressman. Not counting our hourly labor, my mother must have already spent almost half of the $220,000 we were theoretically owed on court filing fees, photocopies, and certified letters. When I had lived at home, my spare time went into organizing the files, photocopying important documents, holding my breath. 2 months after I moved to Oakland, the Supreme Court denied my mother's request that they hear her appeal against the VA. My mother called from the other side of the country, sounding defeated. There was nobody left to argue with. Papa will never have his name back, she said. You know who he was, I said, but it didn't seem to comfort her any. After I got off the phone with her, I'd felt helpless and finally booked a reservation on one of the Alcatraz tour boats. When I got out to the docks at my appointed time, I couldn't bring myself to actually get on the boat. I'd milled around Fisherman's Wharf instead, ducking out of tourist snapshots and trying to name the source of my unease. I'd watched the water for a while, the same fierce, unwavering blue of it that I felt had called me here, and ended up stopping at one of the gift shops on the pier and buying my mother a poster commemorating the Native American takeover of the island. Alcatraz Indians, it said on the front, under a cartoonish picture of something half man, half eagle. I thought it might be easier to remember that this could also be a place of freedom, I scrawled on the back. She never mentioned receiving it. Reticence was not my mother's nature, and when, in the weeks that followed, she had less and less to say about anything, I panicked. She was still a few weeks away from the start of the school year. I insisted she come out to visit me. I wanted to see for myself how bad things were with her. She arrived 20 pounds lighter than when I had seen her a few months ago. My mother, who lived in discount denim and told me once that she found mascara unseemly, was wearing makeup and designer heels. If I hadn't known she didn't believe in mood-altering drugs, I would have taken her for heavily medicated. She was dressed like an actress auditioning for the part of my mother in a movie. A different daughter might have been reassured, but I looked at my mother and saw a person directing all of her energy toward being outwardly composed because the inside was a lost cause. How are you doing? I asked her once we'd gotten from the airport and settled her into my apartment. How do you think? She asked. I offered to sleep on the couch and to give her the bedroom, but she refused, and most nights passed out on the couch by 10 after watching syndicated sitcoms and having 2 glasses of wine. When I'd imagined her having more time for normalcy when the case was over, I hadn't imagined this. Nothing I suggested excited or distracted her. When pressed, she made increasingly bizarre plans for the future. She was moving in with me, never mind that she had a house full of things on the other side of the country. She was moving to France, never mind that she didn't speak French. She was joining the Peace Corps, never mind that she was in her late 40s and had never so much as been camping because she didn't understand why anyone would voluntarily separate themselves from reliable indoor plumbing. It was probably my mother's focus on unlikely and unreasonable futures that gave me the idea that I could still fix something for her. I found Nancy Morton, He was technically my mother's first cousin, and besides me, her last living relative. Nancy was Charlie Sullivan's granddaughter too, and my mother had not seen her since his funeral. The family's failure to bridge their divide in her generation was on her list of ways Papa's legacy was being dishonored. I'd already made arrangements with Nancy and booked the boat tickets by the time I explained the plan to my mother. She was wary. She had tried to reach out to her cousins when the litigation first began, and her letter had come back marked return to sender from the address she had for Nancy's older brother. They're still your family, I insisted. They are not my family, my mother said. We're just related. I'd finally convinced her that the whole trip was what her grandfather would have wanted for us, because I had her own words on my side. Almost immediately, I had doubts about the brilliance of my plan, but it was too late. I'd invited a group of practical strangers to meet us on a boat, and now here we were, instant family, just add water. It was uncharacteristically hot for the bay in August. The air felt thick and stifling like the East Coast summers I left behind. Nancy Morton kept pulling an economy-sized bottle of sunscreen out of her giant straw handbag and slathering gobs of it on her already reddening skin. Her husband, Ken, kept staring at his sneakers. He had barely spoken since we'd all done handshakes and introductions at the pier. Actually, he'd spoken exactly 6 words since then, those words being, "Kelly, put your damn clothes on," when their younger daughter had taken off her damp t-shirt and began walking around in her bikini top. Their older daughter, Sarah, was 23. We shared a birthday, though a year apart, and looked as embarrassed by her family as I was. This was only the 3rd time that my mother and Nancy had seen each other. When they were small children, Nancy and her brother had been brought to their grandparents' house for monthly visits, on the condition that my mother was out of the house. By 6, my mother understood that she was Black and her family was not, and this was why the rule existed. But her understanding was impersonal and matter of fact. It was a rule like gravity, one from a higher authority. From the window of the neighbor's apartment where she'd been sent, my mother could see Nancy on the front steps of their grandparents' building. She was a small girl with a long blonde braid hanging down her back. It brushed against the dingy ground as Nancy did her best to flatten a series of bottle caps with a rock. My mother was generally obedient, but her curiosity and her nagging sense that other children weren't sent away when their families came by got the best of her. While the neighbor who was supposed to be keeping an eye on her watched her stories in the bedroom, my mother went downstairs and peeked through the glass of the front door to get a better look at Nancy, who finally looked up and pressed her face against the other side of the glass to look back. My mother opened the door. "Why were you watching me?" Nancy asked. "We're cousins," said my mother, "and your hair looks pretend." "It's not," said Nancy, "and I don't have cousins." "You too, I live here with our Grammy and Papa." The names meant nothing to Nancy, who called them Grandma and Grandpa Sullivan, but my mother offered as evidence the locket around her neck, the one with her grandparents' pictures sealed in it. It was convincing enough for Nancy, who shrieked and hugged her. Nancy offered her a flattened bottle cap, and my mother said it looked like a coin. They got the idea to play store, make-believe buying and selling flowers and dirt from the backyard, and the clothing and jewelry they were wearing. They were absorbed enough not to notice that Nancy's parents had emerged from the apartment and were on their way out until after Nancy's mother opened the front door and saw them playing together. She screamed her daughter's name and grabbed Nancy by her pigtail, pulling her by her hair down the block to their car, Nancy's neck straining unnaturally backward the whole way. My mother, afraid Nancy's mother would come back for it, clutched the bottle cap in her hand so tightly that it sliced her skin. Nancy cried hysterically as her mother shoved her into the back seat and slammed the door, without a word to her from her husband, who took his son's hand, following his wife and screaming daughter to the car, and started the engine without so much as saying goodbye. My mother watched them drive away like that, her own palm still bleeding. Nancy's tear-streaked face was pressed against the rear window. It was the last time her uncle brought his family over, the last time my mother saw him aside from his parents' funerals. For years, she told and retold Papa the story of the game, as if she could find the detail that had made it go wrong, until she was old enough to understand that she was the detail, the wrong thing. "Someday," Papa told her, "all this foolishness will be done and all my grandchildren and their children will celebrate together." But whatever it would take to make someday happen, it did not seem to be happening in her house. "You have no idea how much you take for granted," my mother told me the first time I'd brought a white friend home to play. But she was wrong about that. You take nothing for granted when the price of it is etched across the face of the person you love the most, when you are born into a series of loans and know you will never be up to the cost of the debt. "Cecilia is studying to be a doctor," my mother told the Mortons as we waited for the ferry to depart. It wasn't true. I had a master's in public health, which my mother liked to think of as a stepping stone to medical school, rather than the beginning of a career in social work. When I told my father what I planned to do with my life, he told me not to blame him for the fact that I'd inherited my mother's enthusiasm for impractical causes, but he sent me the money for the plane ticket. A doctor, said Nancy. That's impressive. Perhaps some of your drive will rub off on Sarah. She has it in her head to go traipsing around the desert for a year. I looked at Sarah with real interest for the first time. She was rolling her eyes and twisting a strand of her hair around her finger so tightly her fingertips were turning red. We were built similarly, tits so that anything you wore that wasn't a giant burlap sack bordered on obscene, but the resemblance ended there. She'd made a pillow out of her Vanderbilt sweatshirt and was resting against it, dangling one arm over the back edge of her seat. Cecilia has always been good with science, my mother said. She gets that from her father's side. I'd wanted to look you up for years, but it was Cecilia and her tech smarts that found you. I never had much of a head for science. My mother was basing my scientific excellence on a ribbon I won for growing hydroponic tomatoes in the 7th grade, though I had subsequently nearly failed biochemistry and dropped physics altogether. My father was a food critic who had recently been berated by a molecular gastronomist for identifying liquid nitrogen as smoke in his review. My tech smarts consisted of having entered Nancy Morton's older brother's name into Google. In fairness to my mother, we had, both of us, grown up without the ability to type someone's name into the ether and receive an immediate report on their current whereabouts. I'd always known about her cousins, but only that year had it occurred to me that one of the great unanswerable questions of her life was now in fact answerable, and instantly at that. The internet did still feel like a kind of mysterious magic then, a new power we had all only recently been granted and were still learning to use. When I finally left the Bay 15 years later, the nonprofit I worked for was shutting down and I was already barely able to keep up with my rent increases. I took a long walk through the hills and looked across the water at the city that tech rebuilt and tried to remember when I'd first seen it coming, when I'd remembered that all magic, all progress has a price. Even at the time, the magic I used to get us answers had a trace of the ominous. It turned out that Nancy's brother had been killed in a car crash 3 years earlier. Nancy and her family had been mentioned in the obituary. I'd offered my belated condolences and invited them down to meet us on one of the Alcatraz ferries. They lived farther north in Sonoma, and after a brief hesitation, she had agreed to drive down for the day. Well, it was different then, Nancy said, with girls in science. They didn't encourage us much, did they, Anne? No, said my mother. No, they didn't. Lots of things were different then. An unsaid thing hung in the air for a moment. Ken Morton cleared his throat. So, he said, why Alcatraz? Lovely day for it, but kind of an odd choice. I was going to ask the same thing. Interesting place for a reunion. We've never been, just moved out here a few years ago and never got around to half the tours. I hear it's beautiful, though. My mother looked like she might cry. Without thinking, I moved closer to her. It hadn't occurred to me to tell them why I had invited them here specifically. I had assumed that they would know. My mother looked like she might cry. Without thinking, I moved closer to her. Oh, sorry. Just read that. Didn't you know, my mother asked, that Papa was in Alcatraz? That's why things happened the way they did? A moment of surprise passed over Nancy's face, and then she collected herself. I had heard, she said slowly, that he had done some time in prison and was never really right after that. I didn't know that it was Alcatraz. You know, I didn't get to know him that well. Not like you did. I guess you didn't, said my mother. Nobody else did. My mother sat on one of the benches on deck and hugged her arms to her chest. I sat down beside her. I could tell that she was trying not to cry. I put an arm around her and patted her shoulder gently. The Mortons looked embarrassed to be there and then turned away to watch San Francisco disappear from view. Okay, that's about halfway through the story. I'm going to stop there so we have time for some conversation.
Hi, Danielle.
Hello.
That was so wonderful. I love that story.
Oh, thank you.
I also love how devastating it is.
That's like, this was like a fraught revision because it was the oldest story in the collection. And it was the only story that I'd ever asked anyone's permission to publish. Even though it's fictional, there were enough sort of details that resonated with real life that I felt like I had to ask. And so, because I couldn't ask my mother about the revision because she was dead by the time I was revising it, I had this really like intense meeting with my editor where I was like, I don't know what to do with the story because I feel like I know what to do with it. But when my mother read it, it had a happy ending and I don't want to change it because it's the only happy story in the book. And my editor very gently was like, you think this story had a happy ending? Which then gave me permission to revise it because apparently it wasn't that happy in the first place. I
I was,
try.
I was going to ask about this because I I love how in Best American Short Stories, and you have two stories in there, how they let writers include endnotes, having to do with how the story came to be. I was going to ask you about this story. I was actually wanted to ask about all the other stories in here. How did this come to be? I was like, oh wait, did she visit Alcatraz first, or did she visit later as research, or like how does a story go from image or an idea to this beautiful thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think often a story for me comes when various things that don't seem to be obviously in conversation intersect. And so parts of the story came from bits and pieces of actual family history. So my great grandfather actually was in Alcatraz when it was a military prison and was pardoned for the crime that they'd accused him of. And he had a happily, he had a longer and happier life than the character in this story. After that, the story diverges wildly from the actual pattern of his life, but he was very much haunted and like had some long-term kind of psychological impact of that time. He was very young. He was under 18 when he was in prison. And so it was a thing that sort of I grew up knowing, and I never met him. He died before I was born. So that was this, obviously that was the part I needed to sort of ask my mother if it was okay to use or to tell. I felt like, because it was a sort of long-term family question of this question of records, whether there wasn't any kind of court case or all the appeals. It was this one of the things that sort of weighed on him was his dishonorable discharge, even though he was pardoned of the murder that he was accused of. So that was all kind of there. And because of that, I spent just a couple of months in Oakland, but I did go to Alcatraz. I don't even know what I was looking for, but I found this sort of weird tourist trap, which was interestingly in conversation with a lot of the other, like the first story in the collection has this sort of strange like recreation of the Titanic. And so I'm interested in like these places that in some ways celebrate a kind of history and almost fetishize that history, but also create this sort of weirdly artificial aesthetic experience that is also a process of erasure and like what's preserved and what's erased. And so that was when I was in college, I think, and it just sort of, it was there and I didn't quite know what to do with it, with like wanting to have this profound experience and not having had it. I never did. I did at one point like find my mother's cousins on Google, but they never wrote back to my email. So now they're in the story.
Well,
No, so I have no idea like who they are or what they're like, or what it would be like to meet them, because they never turned up in real life. So in some ways, like I said, this is an unusual amount of truth in a story, because that's why I asked about writing the story, because it's more kind of actual family material than has ever made it into anything else I've written. But so all of that was there, and I think the kind of the two missing pieces, one of which came in the first draft and one of which came in revision, were that I wanted to kind of think about, I don't know, the original story was kind of a coming of age story, and it was a kind of coming of age story that was partly about somebody learning to set boundaries, but also about like what you give up to live in the present. And so I was interested thematically in thinking about this character, Cecilia, and kind of what it would mean to reckon with and ultimately in some way outlive this history. I think that what came in revision was there was always a kind of retrospective frame. And because I felt in some ways far from the writer who'd written the story, the original draft of the story, or the original version of the story was published 10 years ago, right after my first book came out. It was actually written before my first book came out, the first draft of it. And so trying to go back to it as a different writer, but also seeing it very much in conversation with the questions in a lot of the other stories, I felt like it belonged in this collection, that it was in conversation with this work, but that I needed to work on the frame. And so I put a little bit more pressure on the retrospective narration. And I wanted to think about also the kind of the operation of time, and the moments when time would kind of collapse and the moment could feel as intense in the present as it had at the time, and the moments when something felt bearable from a distance, and the way in which there's a kind of both grace and trauma in that.
Wow, that makes so much sense as I'm thinking about the story, and it resonates with other stories in this collection having to do with sites that become so much more than what they are as like tourist locations, for example, like the water park and the significance of tourism in DC, for example, in the novella. This brings me to another question that I have. And I just wanted to say also that to everyone at home who's joining in from our live studio audience, please feel free to add your questions and Danielle will answer as many of them as she can get to. But because I'm here, I get to ask another question. I feel like I'm kind of like a talk show host or maybe a game show
I
host.
feel like Zoom has made us all talk show hosts. Like we should all have logos now for when we appear on screen.
If this were a game show, what game show would you like to be on with me?
I don't know if you ever met April Wilder, but she's also a Wisconsin former fellow. She and I invented a game show called Why Would You Do That? But we couldn't ever figure out how you won. Just maybe a metaphor and not a game.
Oh wow, that's too good. Too good for that's exactly right for a writing program. So my next question though is about the sort of the incredible range that I experienced when I was reading this book, just the range of characters, the locations, the conflicts. It's all girded by an exploration of grief and the nature of memory and the experience of being Black in America. I kept seeing applications of the title, the Office of Historical Corrections. I just kept seeing that in every story. And I wondered if you could speak to that idea of historical correction throughout the book, especially in terms of the process of writing and revising and sort of sequencing the stories.
Yeah, I mean, the wonderful and terrible thing about being a writer is that you're always being both helped and outsmarted by your own subconscious. So, the first half of writing is waiting to discover what you've written and then being horrified, but it's too late to protect yourself because it's already there. And so I didn't know for a while what the project of this book was. I didn't know if all these stories were part of the same book. Partly I was working on a novel for a long time that was about a historian. And so I would sort of put it away and then secretly write a short story. And I would hold on to the short story until it felt finished because I wasn't really supposed to be writing short stories. So I thought, well, if I don't show it to my agent until it's done, then she can't be mad at me because then she can send it out. Like I don't want to send her something that she has to like then edit and wait for me to fix because then she's just going to be like, why are you wasting my time with short stories? And so she wouldn't do that. She's lovely, my agent. But I felt like I needed to get to give her things that were like ready to go. And so I'd done that kind of like a story at a time for a while, and I would say made up things about, I was working on a story collection down the line, but I would sort of say made up things about what it was actually doing, like what was tethering the work together. And then I would go back and look at the work and be like, actually, it's not doing that, but it does feel like these stories belong together somehow, and I kind of couldn't see it. And I don't think I saw it until I wrote the second to last story that I finished for the collection, not chronologically, which was at the time the most explicit kind of framing of that question of corrections of the record, which is a story called Why Won't Women Say What They Want, which in some ways is like an outlier in the collection, but also feels like very much like it's asking the same question. And I was like, oh, that's what this whole book is about. It's about corrections, it's about records, it's about like who gets to tell a story and who a story belongs to, and the question of like received narratives and the various ways that we might put pressure on them structurally or by giving space in the story to somebody else. And then I could sort of play with that. And so I wrote the novella. I still didn't know that the novella was part of this collection or that it was related to my novel. I never know anything. And then I like start writing and I know something. So I started writing the novella thinking this was like a completely new unrelated novel project and I'd see what I finished first. And then I was like, oh no, this is the same novel project. And it's also the same book that you have been writing. And once I figured that out, it made sense. And I realized sort of how the book was working. And I also realized that I could then just give the story as much room as it needed because I wasn't trying to compress it to be a short story that a journal would take, and I wasn't trying to like expand it into a novel. And it could just kind of anchor the book that I'd already written and be in conversation with those stories. So I did write that last story with the with the explicit understanding that it was like the most direct version of the question that a lot of the other stories were answering or asking more in more nuanced or subtle ways.
Yeah, and I keep seeing people saying that this book is so timely, which is interesting because you read a book for years. And but yeah, we have characters. A character here says something like, we have to agree on what the facts are. And it's such a weighted statement now, more than maybe what it would have been 20 years ago. But this idea of what is a historical correction? What is a correction? What is the fact? What is the true story? That's every character in here is grappling with that in very personal ways. And I love this idea that there's a federal agency, which is in the novella, the title story of this. There's a federal agency devoted to correcting stuff, like not just like memorials out there, but also like flyers. Nothing is too small for characters to fix. So I love that. Okay, so we do have a couple of questions coming up, but first I want to just a quick follow-up about, because I can't not ask you about the novella form, because I love novellas. I love reading them. I think they're a perfect form. They're just novels, but in an easy, smaller format. I don't know why everyone doesn't want to read novellas. And I would love to hear about your experience with the form, how you came to it, what you think of it. Why don't more people write and read novellas?
Yeah, no, and it wasn't something I set out to do. It just sort of, I understood that that was the space the story needed, that what I'd originally mapped out just had a lot of digressions and diversions that didn't serve my purposes. I think part of why I love the short story form is I do love density. I love compression. I love a frame that lets you kind of compress time as much as possible and kind of be in the present, but constantly be flickering between the past and the future, right? I think that's what a short story does really well, is let you build a moment that is kind of very immediate, but also very haunted, and also has tremendous implication for the future, so you can already anticipate how it might reverberate. Sometimes when I'm describing the short story, I'm like, I don't know if I'm describing the short story, I'm describing anxiety, right? Like you're obsessing about the past and being terrified for the future, and also like very alert to the present. But I like that about the story form, and I like that about kind of the density of the page. And so I think I didn't want to like slow the novel down or add things that felt like unnecessary digressions. And because once it clicked, it did click, and I was like, oh, this is the book. And I felt confident that my editor would also see that this was like this was the way the project made the most sense. So I didn't have to worry about trying to sort of set it out on its own and wondering whether anyone would read a novella. I think that's part of why people don't write them more, is because like, what are you going to do with it? Like, every once in a while a magazine will run a novella, but most of the time it's just a hard thing to find a home for. But because I'd already, unbeknownst to me, built it a home, I felt confident in kind of giving it the room that I thought it needed. I did think it needed more room than a short story, because it has that kind of world building, because it has to have that sort of grounding in like, this is kind of the near future, but also an alternate future. And so here is what's like familiar and recognizably real, and here is what's a little bit different. Although even some of those markers, like I finished this in, I finished this book in like October of 2019. It went into press, and it was like, and I finished the draft of the novella in 2018, and then I had been revising it. And so the book was like in print in 2019. And then in summer of 2020, there was this whole conversation about Juneteenth and like how people get it wrong. And I was like, no, that was one of my cues that we were in the future. There's like a gentrified Juneteenth joke on like page 3 that was not meant to be topical. And so there were moments like that when I was like, if we weren't already in galleys, I would change it, but it's too late now. But so it was kind of trying to build the frame world long enough, because some of the future, most of the future is imagined, some of the past is imagined, right? And so to sort of think of like, what are the markers that I want people to sort of know are real, and where do I want people to know that I'm taking liberties?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that works still perfectly when she sees that in the bakery. about Juneteenth.
If you imagine the future and get it right, at least people like don't think like, oh, like there are all these people complaining about 2020 books because they didn't mention the pandemic. Like
Right.
they're like, well, this book is set in 2020 and these people are just acting like there's no, and I'm like, yeah, people were just not psychic when they wrote their books in 2020.
Right. But the idea of a Juneteenth cake was that really stayed
Probably there probably will be some bakery in
Probably
DC
are.
wrongly advertising Juneteenth cakes in a couple of years, so I'm safe.
Some questions from the audience. The first question is, I just finished the book and loved it. The novella features a fictional town near the Fox Valley in Wisconsin. What made you want to write about that area of Wisconsin?
Yeah, I think I did some sort of geographic triangulation. I wanted to think about a smaller community than, when I lived in Wisconsin, I lived in Madison, and I also wanted it to be within driving distance of some other parts of the state that I had spent some time in, because originally there was a longer road trip, my longer version of the novella, like there was also a stop in Chicago, there was like, she drove through Illinois, there was like a whole map. And eventually I just kind of compressed the map and I was like, she needs to go to Kenosha and Milwaukee and some other place. And so partly I was trying to find a place. I was also trying to think about where, because it has that kind of a long history, like I was looking at records of the history of migration to Wisconsin and the history specifically of Black people in Wisconsin, which is like, the records are really spotty. And so I was trying to find a part of the state where I could conceivably have somebody get from Milwaukee, which would be far enough away that he wouldn't have a community there, and far enough away that if you were trying to sort of cut ties, you might go. So partly it was just a question of geography, but it's also sometimes I think about like, what does this town need to have? It needs like a mill, it needs like a tourist hole, it needs, and so it was a sort of partly map and partly practical kind of where could this place be, that it could do the things I need it to do. And there wasn't quite a real town that had all of the necessary things, but that is sort of one of the joys of fiction, is like a fake town has appeared on the map, and still like ask some of the questions about place that feel relevant to a real place.
Yeah, it's funny because I live in Wisconsin, but I haven't actually been anywhere in it really, partly because of the pandemic. So I look at these places on the map and I'm like, I wonder where Door County actually is with the famous cherries, and maybe one day
They're nice cherries.
I'll go take a look.
No, honestly, I didn't like cherries until I moved to Wisconsin, and suddenly I was like, oh, people have been lying to me about what a cherry is all these years.
You like cherries now?
I do.
I love cherries. That's why I really would like to go if I could one day. Another question. This is about writing and research processes. And this question it looks like it's really about the story you just read, Alcatraz, but I think it can speak to numerous stories in this collection. The story has a complicated legal procedure intertwined with family drama, and you've made that so clear and fascinating. It'd be great to hear how you approach research and how that affects your process.
Yeah, I think that it's partly, it's really more paring down. I mean, I think I do believe in research, but research can also become a thing where you're like, I must know everything about this thing. And you get to a certain point where you're like, actually, I should have started with the story and then spot checked, because what you don't want is to get something so wildly wrong that like somebody doesn't trust you anymore. But often if you're interested in something, you have some familiarity with the topic, you have some basis for like what you want to explore about it. And I think you can get bogged down in being like, like when I was writing a novel about a historian, I was like, well, I just have to understand all of US history and then I'll be able to finish this book. And obviously like eventually I had way more interesting facts than I could ever put in a book that anyone would want to read, and was getting like farther and farther from my story. And so I think that part of how I revise is I start with a story and then I go figure out what I need to know more about to make it make sense. And then I pare that down, right? Often when I go back and do my like fleshed out draft, then I have too much information and it gets confusing because everybody's like, well, why do we have all of these? So like part of what happened in this story, even with the sort of actual family history, was that there are like many fewer characters, right, than are actually involved in my mother's family, because like I didn't have time to introduce 25 people. Like the core of the story was this relationship between this woman and her grandfather and these sort of lost cousins. And so everybody else kind of had to go, which I could do because it was fiction. So sometimes just kind of paring down and saying like, where do I want the reader to look? And then how can I get that density of things that illuminate each other when they're pressed together, but also feel like they could be natural kind of transitions, right? Like I'm here in this moment and this is happening, but this is also what I'm thinking about. Sometimes structure is like a function of character or the psychology of the story, like whose point of view is it from, and what would they compress even just kind of associatively, and how is that doing voice work and characterization work so that it feels like someone's telling you a story, and then you can kind of go with it, as opposed to if it felt like if I was trying to write a history, like that would be a mess as a history book, right? Because you'd be like, but wait a minute, you just like dropped that thread for 5 pages and came back to it. But can I like put it in the voice of somebody who sounds like they're telling you a story so that it makes sense to you that these are the associations or leaps or gaps in this person's version of the story?
Yeah, I definitely have reached the point numerous times when I have realized that my research is actually just procrastination. And that's a harsh realization. Next question is about, this is kind of a fun question. Do you read your stories out loud to yourself when editing to see how they flow?
I do, usually at the very end. My first revision is almost always structural. So I start with, I get to the end of the story, I can figure out what the story is. I try to figure out if I've gotten the shape of the story right. And often that's less about the plot. Like if I can get to the end of the story, usually I've resolved the plot, or what Judy Mitchell, who I think is somewhere in the audience, calls like the small question. If I can get to the end of the story, if I can get to the end of the first draft, I think that I've like usually answered that question to my satisfaction. It's the other question, right? It's the sort of the larger question or the other thing that is the bigger ask, because often I don't know what a story is about until I get to like the second to last page of the first draft, and then the story tries to kill me and announces its theme, and I'm like, oh, this is what this was about. And so sometimes the story also is happily like in the right shape, and that revelation, it will also work for the reader. But sometimes that revelation for me is like, oh, you should have focused the story differently, you should have started it at a different place, you should have centered different things, because here's the actual like thematic thing of the story, or the big thing of the story. So I sometimes do like a major rewrite, sometimes I do a kind of spot checky rewrite for scene and character, and then I edit for sentences. And again, people's processes are all wildly different. I know writers who cannot like move on from one sentence until the last one is perfect. Like that would drive me crazy. I could not do it. But there are people who work that way and they get things done and they're lovely when they're done. So like however it gets done, it gets done. But I don't write that way. So like once I feel like the pieces of the story are pinned down, then I go and I read sentence by sentence. And I read it also like starting from the end, because I think that sometimes disrupts your brain's tendency to like correct for things. Sometimes you just catch a sentence or a word that feels like it stands out because you've sort of disrupted your own sense of the narrative. So I read sentence by sentence, I think it's done, and then I read backwards sentence by sentence, and then I read it out loud to catch her voice.
Backwards. I've never tried that.
I feel like I read it in a writing book somewhere, and it was one of those tips that sounded wacky, and like I would try it once and hate it. And I was like, oh no, this somehow jogged something in my brain. It works.
I'm going to try that next. That's a good one. I was just talking to another writer yesterday who said that she will have her computer read her work to her.
Oh, I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of a relationship with my computer.
That sort of
That feels like more intimacy than I want with my technology.
And that sounded really scary to me. I'm also not ready for that.
But I'm glad it works for her.
Yeah, whatever works. Thank goodness for that. So the next question, this is interesting. The next question is, did you have any interesting rituals while writing this book, or any experiences you'd like to share while you were writing this book that you weren't expecting to happen?
I mean, I never expect anything to happen. Like I think that I don't don't have enough of a process for it to be a ritual, I think. And I think that's fine, you know? I mean, I think I write when it feels like something is urgent, and there's enough writing in the world to keep everybody busy that if I don't have something that feels urgent, like I don't need to force it. And I think, I mean, also because I have a life that has a flexible schedule, right? That I'm able to have a process that's sort of like, I will write when I feel like it, because I don't have anybody in my house. I have like several cats who, I'm sorry, are just like about to knock over my Christmas tree off screen, so forgive me. But in general, right, it's like I can sort of, I think that I might need a routine or a process if I had like a job with flexible time, or like people I was responsible for. I didn't write much when I was my mother's primary caretaker for years, and like that was fine too. Like I had to be a person, you know. And so I guess I'm not big on writing ritual, because I feel like you write when the magic shows up, and that's okay. I do, like, in general, I think that I have every book has its own candle. That is true. Like when I am writing, I find like the right scented candle for that book, and I hope they don't discontinue it before I finish. Or every story, like sometimes like this thing has this thing, but I guess that's a ritual, but that's as close as I get.
So if you encounter that scent elsewhere, does it bring that project or that story, that book back to you?
I don't know, it's always some weirdly specific. That's why you have to get some like weird, obscure, like limited edition candle. It can't just be like a lavender.
Wow, I love that one. Okay. So no music while you're writing?
I can't listen to music and write at the same time. I can sometimes listen to jazz. So like I will sometimes listen to Mingus and revise, but I can't listen to anything while I'm drafting. It's just like it somehow fights with my brain space.
Yeah, I feel the same. The next question is, in your wildest dreams, what kind of project would you tackle next?
In my wildest dreams, I will for once do what my editors actually asked me to do, and work on this novel that I promised her. You know, I think there are many things that I will never learn as a writer or as a human, and I'm fine with that. But the one lesson I've learned is like talk less about work in progress. So I'm keeping it kind of close to the vest, but I am working on a thing, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what my editor gets. Hopefully what she asked for. That's my wildest dream.
Yay, I can't wait. We all can't wait. The next question, these are really fun questions. If you had to pick one book from behind you to show us, which one would it be?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I may have to get up and go look at my bookshelf, so forgive me.
The question is making Danielle actually get up and
Okay, I mean, I'll find a real one. This one's for fun. Everyone knows I'm a big fan of Mariah Carey. So this is Mariah Carey's memoir that I just finished. I'm actually in a book club that is reading this book. Delightful. Well, let's see. What would I show you?
I've heard really good things about that memoir.
This is one of my like 2 novels that I read all the time. Jazz and Mrs. Dalloway, and which I think are oddly actually like interesting books to think of in conversation. They're both about this sort of space of a city after a war or a trauma, and this sort of collective upheaval and trauma and hope and delight and busyness and crowdedness. And they both, like, I think what I want from a novel is either I want it to be like very compressed and like be a lovely thing that takes place in the shape of like one afternoon, or I want it to be like sprawling and expansive and like polyphonic. And somehow both of those novels are both of those things, which feel like usually they're at odds. Like either a novel is kind of compressed and perfect, or it's like spiraling and messy and like encompassing of all kinds of enormous commentary. And I think that I love both of those books so much because they both do both of those things.
Okay, so we have
Jazz. It's not a first edition, but it was a gift from my stepmother's mother who passed a few years ago, but it's an early edition of Jazz.
I have that one too. The exact one. Jazz by Toni Morrison, and you said Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and Mariah Carey's memoir. That's an excellent.
Mrs. Dalloway is actually not on the shelf. Mrs. Dalloway is trapped in my office where you have to have like 15 permits to go now.
Mrs. Dalloway is trapped in herself.
She has a giraffe. I have an office giraffe to keep the books in my office company.
Oh, that's a giant giraffe, right? I love it. Okay, so we sadly are about at the end of our event, which means it is time for our conclusion, the bonus lightning round, pandemic edition.
Okay, I'm ready.
3 fast questions for you, Danielle Evans. Number 1, when it is okay for everybody to travel again, where do you think you want to go first?
Okay, I have an answer to this because well, I have 2 answers. Can I cheat and have 2 answers?
Okay,
I'm
fine.
gonna go to London because I have a UK edition of this book coming out, and I was so excited that I was gonna get a UK book tour, or at least like visit my UK publisher. But it's coming out in March, and I don't think anyone's gonna get on a plane to the UK in March. But I'm hoping that at some point, like later that year, I can go meet my UK editor. Because I've never been to London. I wanted to go to London once. I had a friend who lived in Paris for a while, and I went to visit her. And every time I wanted to go to London, she was like, "You are in the most beautiful city in the world, and you were going to get on a train to London." And she wouldn't let me get on a train. so, so I've never seen London, but I would like to. And then I need to go to the Pacific. Like I make an annual trip to the Pacific because it's my mother's ashes a few years ago, and she didn't want she didn't want to be buried somewhere. She wanted like to be remembered in a way that felt like alive. My mother loved beaches, and so every year I go to the beach at the Pacific and have like both a joyful, like relaxing vacation and also like a way of grieving. I guess it's another ritual that I've developed. But I could not go to the Pacific this year. This would be my month. But here I am.
Next year, London and the Pacific. Question 2, what is a pandemic purchase you've made that you recommend?
Okay, well, I purchase candles all the time, so they don't really count. But my friend Susanna, who I think is maybe in the audience somewhere, or she's in Madison if she's not in this actual audience, sent me a couple years ago these like delightful candles from this place called Catbird, which I've become like, they're not my writing candles because I like them so much, I use them all the time, so I can't like limit them to writing. So I bought a bunch of candles. I bought an immersion blender because I like have to cook all of my own food all the time now, and so like now I can just make and freeze delightful soups. So I would recommend. Oh, also I've become a person who like exercises. Like I bought a bike, a Peloton before the pandemic, so it doesn't really count because I was on leave. But like I have all these like peppy friends now. It's terrifying.
That
I
is
really miss my vices. But I mean, I kind of love it.
That's very healthy. Okay. Catbird candles, immersion blender, and a bicycle? Exercise bicycle, Peloton. Okay, well, those are good purchases. Way better than mine. Just lots of impractical like satin loungewear. And the last question of the evening, what is something we all should do to stay okay to get through these next few months?
Are we required to be okay? Is that a rule? I mean, not to be cliche, but I do think it's a good time to read, right? It's like gonna be cold. It's probably already cold there. Like the sort of outside frolicking or getting of air can't really happen as much anymore. So I would say hoard some books and pull up with them and call your friends and tell them about them. Like
Absolutely, a book club. Zoom works really well for a book club. And you know what? Let's all start with this one if you haven't read it yet. Danielle, thank you so much for being here and for this beautiful book.
Thank you. It's so nice to see your face, and I hope to maybe by the paperback actually make it to like see people in person.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, folks. On behalf of UW-Madison's program in creative writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival, I'd like to thank Danielle Evans for gracing us with her virtual presence and sharing her masterful work with us tonight, and Beth Nguyen for that lovely and engaging conversation. And I'd like to thank all of you for making the long drive to your computer or tablet to be here tonight, so please drive home safe. Holiday shopping is upon us, so whether you're considering the Office of Historical Corrections as a gift for a loved one or as a literary companion this quarantined winter, please support a local independent bookstore and place orders through our partnering stores. You can find a full list of them and their contact info at our webpage, tinyurl.com/whiskweds. This is the last Wisconsin Wednesday of the year. Can't believe we've had all those readings. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us and hear from these fantastic writers whom the Wisconsin Institute in Creative Writing has had the immense privilege of getting to know. We'll be back in the spring with more events, including readings from the 2020-2021 Wisconsin Institute Fellows and the graduating MFA cohort. The first Wisconsin Book Festival event will be Emily St. John Mandel for the Glass Hotel in conversation with Chloe Benjamin on Tuesday, February 16th. And our first Wisconsin Wednesday of 2021 will be February 17, featuring Dantiel W. Moniz and Lady Hubbard. You'll find updates on our site and on our email list. So again, thank you for logging on. Thank you so much to Danielle and Beth for tonight. Thank you to Connor Moran for manning tech. I'm Mishka Ligot with the UW-Madison Program in Creative Writing and the Wisconsin Book Festival. Take care, stay home, wear a mask, wash your hands, hang in there, have a safe and festive holiday season. We hope to see you all next at the first Wisconsin Wednesday of 2021. Good night. Happy holidays.